To you, dear friend, wherever you find yourself this evening, perhaps in your favorite chair by the window, or on the porch watching the last light fade behind the trees, I offer this story. It is not about heroes or grand adventures. It is about something quieter and truer. The moment when a person left for dead discovers that being unwanted by some does not mean being worthless to all. This is how Margaret found her way home, though she did not know she was looking for one. I tell it the way stories ought to be told, simply, honestly. The way folks used to share them on long evenings when the work was done and the coffee was still warm. May it bring you comfort, as it has brought comfort to me in the telling. The wagon train was already a smudge against the horizon when Margaret stopped counting her steps. 347. She had counted that many before the numbers lost their meaning, before the dust coating her throat made swallowing feel like a small betrayal. The taste of chalk sat between her teeth. Sagebrush smell hung heavy in the still air, thick and bitter, the way it always smelled in high summer when the rain refused to come. Now she just walked, one foot, then the other. The leather of her boots had cracked along the seams where she had patched them twice already. She could feel pebbles through the worn soles, sharp little reminders that the road did not care whether she made it to the end or not. Colorado stretched out around her in every direction, red dirt, sagebrush, distant mountains that never seemed to get closer, no matter how long she walked. The afternoon sun pressed down on her shoulders like a hand trying to push her into the earth. She did not look back at the wagon train again. There was no point. Can't afford. Or dead weight. The trail leader's voice still rang in her ears. He had not been cruel about it. That was the worst part. He had spoken the way a man speaks when he is doing arithmetic calculating provisions. Water, the strain on the oxen. She had simply failed to add up to something worth keeping. Sorry, ma'am. It's just numbers. Margaret adjusted the canvas bag on her shoulder. The strap cut into her flesh where the padding had worn through months ago. Inside the bag, a tin cup, dented along the rim from when she was 12 years old, and dropped it drawing water from the well behind her parents' farmhouse back in Ohio. Her mother's Bible, the pages soft as cloth from years of handling. A daguerreotype in a tarnished brass frame, her parents, posed stiff and unsmiling the way people did for photographs. Both of them gone now. Both of them beyond caring what became of their only daughter. Everything she owned fit in a bag she could carry with one hand. She had always been a practical woman, farm-raised, strong enough to split wood and haul water and work from before dawn until after dark. But practicality had not saved her. The wagon company had looked at her and seen what everyone always saw: a woman too large, too plain, too much of a burden. The irony sat bitter in her mouth. She had never asked anyone for anything, never complained when the rations ran short, never slowed the group down, not once in 3 months of travel. But when the water supplies dwindled and the oxen began to struggle, someone had to go, and she was the easiest to leave behind. Margaret stopped walking. Her breath came hard now, rasping in her chest like something had come loose inside. She found a flat rock by the side of the road, just a boulder. Really. The kind that littered this landscape like scattered coins, and she sat down. The relief of being off her feet made her eyes sting. She would not cry. She had promised herself that much. Crying was for people who still believed tears could change anything. And Margaret had stopped believing that a long time ago. Instead, she removed her boots. The cloth patches were pulling away from the leather again. Her stockings were gray with dust, and there was a blister on her right heel that had broken open sometime in the last mile. leaving a raw patch of skin that throbbed with each heartbeat. She looked at her feet for a long moment. Then she looked at the road, stretching ahead empty, endless, disappearing into the shimmer of heat where the earth met the sky. Now what? The question sat in her chest like a stone. She had no answer for it. No plan. The nearest town was miles away. Maybe more. She had no money. No connections. No one waiting for her anywhere in this vast territory. The wagon train had been her last chance at reaching the mining settlements, where a woman could find work cooking, cleaning, laundering clothes for men who had no wives to do it for them. That chance was gone now. Rolling away toward the horizon in a cloud of red dust, Margaret reached into her canvas bag and pulled out the tin cup. Empty. She had finished the last of her water an hour ago. She turned the cup in her hands. The dent along the rim caught the light. 20 years she had carried this cup. From Ohio to Missouri to Kansas to here. This nameless stretch of Colorado territory where no one would ever know or care that she had passed through. 32 years old, unmarried, orphaned, abandoned. The words lined up in her mind like items on a list, each one a small verdict rendered against her. She put the cup back in the bag. Then she put her boots back on, ignoring the way the broken blisters screamed against the rough leather, and she stood up. Wasn't much choice, really. Walk or quit? And Margaret had never been one for quitting. The thought was not hopeful. It was just practical. The only choice left was to keep moving forward, because sitting still meant waiting for the end. And she was not ready for that. Not yet. Not while her legs could still carry her. She walked. The sun slid lower in the sky, painting the mountains in shades of orange and purple that would have been beautiful if she had any beauty left in her to appreciate them. Her shadow stretched long and distorted on the red dirt, a dark shape that could have been anyone at all. Margaret looked at that shadow for a moment. She did not look away from it. And she kept walking, one foot after the other, into the gathering dusk of the Colorado territory, alone with nothing but the sound of her own breathing and the vast silence of the land. Somewhere behind her, the wagon train had already forgotten her name. If this story finds you tonight, I would be glad to know where you are reading from. Perhaps we share something in common, looking for a place where we belong. Leave a word below and let me know your corner of the world. As the old folks used to say, a story shared is a burden halved. Hoofbeats. Margaret's hands curled into fists before she could think. The sound came from behind her, steady, unhurried. A single horse moving at a walk. She did not turn around. Her shoulders drew up toward her ears, bracing for whatever came next. Just keep walking. But her legs had stopped obeying her. The blisters on her feet had turned to fire, and her knees wobbled with each step like a newborn calf learning to stand. The hoofbeats grew louder. Closer. She could hear the creak of saddle leather now, the soft blow of the horse's breath, the jingle of a bit chain as the animal shook its head. Margaret stopped walking. There was no point pretending she could outrun a horse. She turned around, squinting against the low afternoon sun, and waited. The rider was a man past his middle years' weathered face, silver threading through the hair at his temples, a wool vest over a cotton work shirt that had seen better days but fit him well. His boots were good leather, she noticed, though caked with honest dirt. The horse beneath him was a bay gelding, well-muscled, with a saddle worn smooth at the stirrups from years of use. He reined in a few yards away and dismounted slow. No sudden movements, like approaching a spooked animal, Margaret thought. And the observation sat bitter in her throat. The man reached for something at his hip. Her breath caught, but it was only a canteen silver. Dented near the cap, and he held it out toward her without a word. She could hear the water slosh inside as he extended his arm. Margaret looked at the canteen, then at his face. He was not looking at her body. Not the way men usually did, that quick flick of the eyes that measured and found her wanting. He was looking at her face, waiting. She took the canteen. Their fingers brushed. He did not pull back. The water tasted like copper and cool relief. She drank until her throat stopped burning, then forced herself to stop, handed the canteen back. "Silas Thornton," the man said. His voice was low, rough at the edges, like a road that had seen too much travel. "Got a place about 4 miles east." Margaret said nothing, waited for the rest of it. The joke. The price. "Got a spare room," he continued. "Housekeeper's getting on in years. Could use another pair of hands." A pause. "If you're willing to work." The words hung in the air between them. "Why?" The question scraped out before she could stop it. Silas Thornton looked at her for a long moment. Something moved behind his eyes. Not pity, not curiosity. Something she could not name. "Reckon everyone deserves a roof," he said finally. "Ain't nobody's business why." Margaret's hands were trembling. She pressed them flat against her skirt to hide it. 4 miles east. A spare room. Work. It sounded like a second chance. It sounded like a trap. She opened her mouth to answer, and that was when she noticed the wedding ring on his left hand. Gold, worn thin from years of wearing, and beside it on his smallest finger, a smaller ring. Silver. Too small for a grown man's hand? A child's ring. What kind of man wears a dead child's ring on his own finger? The ranch house appeared against the darkening sky like something from a half-remembered dream. 2 stories. Wraparound porch. A barn and corrals spread out behind it. All of it solid and well-built. The kind of place that spoke of years of hard work and careful tending. The wood was good timber. The fences straight and true. The outbuildings arranged with the practical eye of a man who understood how a working ranch should flow. But something was wrong. Margaret felt it before she could name it. The flower beds along the front of the house had gone wild, tangled with weeds and dead stalks that nobody had bothered to clear. The curtains in the upstairs windows were drawn tight against the fading light. A porch swing hung motionless from its chains, and when the evening breeze stirred, the chains creaked with the lonely sound of something long unused. The house was holding its breath. Silas Thornton reined in the gelding near the front steps and dismounted without speaking. He offered his hand to help Margaret down from where she had been riding behind him, her thighs aching from gripping the horse's sides. Her fingers cramped from clutching the back of his vest for 4 miles of rough road. She took his hand, let go the moment her feet touched solid ground. The front door opened before they reached the porch steps. A woman stood in the doorway, Mexican, with gray-streaked hair pulled back from a face that had seen enough years to know better than to ask questions that did not need asking. Her hands were rough and red from work, her apron dusted with flour. Her dark eyes moved over Margaret in a single quick sweep, measuring and calculating. "Senor Thornton, don't bring people home," the woman said. Her voice was flat, careful, neither welcoming nor cold. You must be something. Margaret did not know what to say to that. She stayed silent. The woman stepped aside. I am Rosa. I keep the house. Come. Inside, the air smelled of kerosene and old wood and something underneath something empty, like a room that had been closed up too long and forgotten. Margaret followed Rosa through a kitchen where a cast-iron stove radiated warmth that felt almost shocking after the chill of the evening ride. The smell of beans simmering mixed with the sharper scent of coffee kept hot too long. They passed a parlor where the furniture sat shrouded beneath white sheets, shapeless forms in the dim light like ghosts waiting to be remembered. Your room, Rosa said, stopping before a door at the end of a narrow hallway. The floorboards creaked beneath their feet with every step, announcing their presence to the silent house. Small, clean, bed is good. The room was exactly as Rosa described. A narrow bed with an iron frame. The mattress thin, but not lumpy. A cedar chest at the foot, the wood dark with age. And when Margaret breathed in, she caught the sharp, clean smell of the cedar mixed with dust and thyme. A single window faced the mountains, now just dark shapes against a sky going purple with the last of the light. Margaret set her canvas bag on the floor. The weight of it leaving her shoulder felt strange, like setting down something she had been carrying for longer than she could remember. She looked around the room. Bare walls, simple furniture. Nothing personal. Nothing to suggest anyone had ever lived here or loved here or called this place home. Except her eyes caught on something pinned above the washstand in the corner. A piece of butcher paper, yellowed at the edges, curling slightly where the pin had pulled at the fibers. The paper was covered in the unsteady strokes of a child's drawing a horse with too many legs. A crooked sun in the upper corner trailing lines of yellow like hair. And at the bottom, in letters that wobbled and leaned like they had been written by a hand, still learning how to hold a pencil, Papa. Margaret's throat went tight. She moved closer to the washstand. Her boots were quiet on the wooden floor, on the windowsill, nearly hidden behind the thin calico curtain. Sat a pressed flower, a columbine, its petals brown and brittle with age, preserved between two pieces of glass that had been tied together with a faded ribbon. Someone had placed it there with care, positioned it just so, where the morning light would catch it. A woman had done this, a woman who had lived in this house, who had pressed flowers and hung them in the window, who had watched a child draw pictures for his father and pinned them to the wall where they could be seen every day. A woman who was not here anymore. Fever took them. Rosa's voice came from the doorway. Margaret had not heard her return, had not heard the floorboards creak beneath her feet. Senora Catherine and the boy? William? 3 years now? Margaret did not turn around. She kept her eyes on the pressed flower. On the way, the last light from the window caught the edges of the dried petals and made them glow, like something trying to remember how to be alive. Senor Thornton, Rosa continued, her voice soft and matter-of-fact in the way of people who have learned to speak of grief without drowning in it. He don't use most of the house no more. Keeps to his study in the barn. The work. The silence stretched between them, filled only by the distant sound of the wind outside and the creak of the old house settling into evening. Supper in 1 hour, Rosa said. Beans? Cornbread? Coffee strong enough to stand a spoon in. You eat, then you rest. Tomorrow we talk about work. Her footsteps retreated down the hallway, each one marked by the groan of the floorboards. Margaret stood alone in the small room, surrounded by the traces of a family she had never known. The child's drawing watched her from the wall, its crooked horse frozen in mid-gallop, running toward something or away from something she could not tell which. She reached out and touched the edge of the paper with one finger. The butcher paper was soft with age under her fingertip, fragile as moth wings, as old promises, as the memory of someone loved and lost. 3 years. This drawing had been hanging here for 3 years. The flower had been pressed and placed on this windowsill 3 years ago, and Silas Thornton had left them exactly where they were, untouched, preserved in place like specimens in a museum built from grief. Margaret's hand dropped to her side. She understood now. The silence of the house, the drawn curtains, the furniture wrapped in sheets like bodies waiting for burial, the way Rosa spoke of the past in flat, careful tones. This was not a home anymore. This was a house, holding its breath, waiting for something that was never coming back. And somehow she had walked right into the middle of it. The question rose in her mind before she could stop it. Sharp and sudden as a splinter working its way beneath the skin. What kind of man keeps a dead house breathing for 3 years? And why did he bring me here to share it? Margaret saw them on her 3rd morning at the ranch. She was hauling water from the well behind the kitchen, her arms straining against the weight of the bucket, the rope rough against her palms. The morning air smelled of dew and sage, and the faint sweetness of grass still wet from the night. She set the bucket down to rest her shoulders, and that was when movement caught the corner of her eye. The bunkhouse window. A face small, pale, there and gone before she could blink. Margaret straightened her back, looked again at the window. Nothing. Just the weathered gray wood of the bunkhouse wall, the glass reflecting the early morning sky like a blind eye. But she had seen it. A child's face, watching her. She carried the water inside and found Rosa at the kitchen table, her hands working a ball of masa into flat circles for tortillas. The smell of lard warming in the cast-iron skillet filled the small space, rich and familiar, mixing with the sharper scent of dried chilies hanging from the ceiling beams. "The bunkhouse," Margaret said. She did not phrase it as a question. Rosa's hands paused for just a moment, then continued their work, pressing and turning, the soft pat of dough against the worn wooden table marking a steady rhythm. "The little ones," Rosa said. Her voice was careful, measured, the voice of someone choosing words like stepping stones across a creek. "Thomas, Samuel, Lily." Margaret waited. The skillet popped and hissed as Rosa laid a tortilla flat against the hot iron. Their parents had a homestead about 20 miles north. Rosa shaped another circle of dough, her movements automatic after years of practice. Fever came through last spring, took both of them inside a week, left the children with nothing but an empty cabin and a milk cow gone dry. The words settled into the kitchen like stones dropping into still water. Senor Thornton found them when he rode out to check on the family, found them alone. The boy Thomas was trying to dig a grave for his mother. The ground was too hard. He had blisters on his hands the size of silver dollars. Rosa flipped the tortilla. The smell of it browning filled the air. The neighbors wanted to send them on the orphan train and said it was the only proper thing to do. She shook her head, a small movement, barely there. "Lord knows those trains ain't kind to children. Ship them east like cattle. Hand them out to whoever wants a farmhand or a servant girl. Some find good families. Many don't." Margaret thought of the stories she had heard on the wagon train. Children loaded into railroad cars, names pinned to their coats like packages, shipped across the country to be claimed by strangers. The lucky ones found love. The rest found work. He took them in, Margaret said. 3 months now. Rosa lifted the tortilla from the skillet and added it to the stack wrapped in a clean cloth. They sleep in the bunkhouse with the ranch hands. The men look after them well enough, feed them, keep them warm, make sure they got blankets when the nights turn cold. She looked at Margaret, her dark eyes steady. But ranch hands don't know how to comfort children, don't know how to make a child feel safe when they wake up crying in the night for a mama who ain't coming back. Margaret looked toward the window, toward the bunkhouse she could not see from here. 3 children, orphaned, living among cowboys who had no notion what to do with small hearts and bad dreams. They're scared of strangers, Rosa added, turning back to her work. Thomas, especially. He's the oldest. 10 years. Thinks it's his job now to protect the younger ones, to be the man of the family. Got a chip on his shoulder the size of Pike's Peak. Margaret nodded slowly. She understood that weight. The burden of being responsible for someone smaller. Someone who depended on you when you could barely hold yourself together. She had carried that same weight when her mother fell sick, and her father could not stop drinking long enough to notice that his family was falling apart around him. She did not ask permission, did not plan what she would do. She simply went to the pantry, found the flour and lard and salt and buttermilk, and began to make biscuits. Rosa watched her for a moment, hands still on the masa, said nothing, went back to her tortillas. The biscuits came out of the oven golden brown, their tops cracked and rough the way Margaret's mother had taught her to make them back in Ohio. Back when the kitchen smelled of wood smoke, and her mother's hands were still strong enough to knead dough. Margaret wrapped them in a clean flour sack cloth, the fabric soft against her fingers, and walked out the back door toward the bunkhouse. The distance was not far, 50 yards, maybe less, but each step felt heavy, deliberate, like walking toward something that could not be undone once started. She knocked on the bunkhouse door. The sound echoed in the morning stillness, too loud against the quiet. No answer. She knocked again. "I brought food," she said. Her voice sounded strange to her own ears. Rough, uncertain, rusty from too many years of having no one to talk to. Biscuits, fresh from the oven, still warm. Silence stretched thin as wire. Then the door opened a crack, just wide enough for a single eye to peer through. A boy's face appeared in the gap. Sharp features that would be handsome someday, but were too thin now. Brown hair that needed cutting falling across his forehead. Eyes that held the kind of hard suspicion that should never belong to a 10-year-old child. He looked at Margaret, looked at the cloth bundle in her hands, looked back at her face with the measuring gaze of someone who had learned too young that adults could not be trusted. "What do you want?" His voice was flat, guarded, a wall built from words. "Nothing." Margaret held out the biscuits. The smell of them rose between them, warm and yeasty and comforting. "Just thought you might be hungry." The boy, Thomas, she remembered, did not move to take them. Behind him, in the dim interior of the bunkhouse, Margaret could see 2 more shapes, smaller, huddled together on one of the iron cots, watching from the shadows with eyes that caught the light like startled deer. "We don't need charity," Thomas said. The words came out hard, practiced, a shield he had learned to raise against the world. "It ain't charity." Margaret kept her voice steady, matter of fact, the way she would speak to a spooked horse. "It's biscuits. There's a difference." Something flickered behind the boy's eyes. Not trust, nothing so easy as that, but something. A crack in the wall, small as a hairline fracture in old plaster. The door opened wider. Margaret stepped inside, The bunkhouse smelled of wool blankets and cold wood smoke and the sour, sweet scent of children who had not had a proper bath in too long. Iron cots lined the walls, each one made up with rough gray blankets. A small potbelly stove sat in the corner, cold now in the warmth of the morning, ash spilling from its grate onto the plank floor. The two smaller children huddled together on the nearest cot. A boy 7 years old, maybe, with the same brown hair as Thomas and eyes that looked too large for his thin face, bruised underneath with shadows that spoke of too many sleepless nights, and a girl, tiny, 5 years old at most, with tangled dark hair and a dress that had been patched so many times the original fabric was barely visible beneath the repairs. Margaret unwrapped the biscuits and set them on the cot beside the children. The smell of them filled the cramped space, and she saw the younger boy's nostrils flare, saw his tongue dart out to wet his cracked lips. "Go on," she said quietly. "They're best when they're still warm." Thomas hesitated, his jaw tight. Then he gave a small nod to his brother. The younger boy, Samuel. Margaret remembered from Rosa's words, grabbed a biscuit, and bit into it like he was afraid someone would snatch it away before he could taste it. Crumbs scattered across his chin and down the front of his patched shirt. He chewed with his eyes closed, and a small sound escaped his throat. Something between a sigh and a whimper. The sound of hunger being answered. The little girl had not moved. Margaret lowered herself to her knees, the movement slow and careful, bringing her face level with the child. Her joints protested, her body aching from days of walking and riding and sleeping on an unfamiliar mattress in an unfamiliar room. "What's your name?" Margaret asked softly. The girl did not answer. Her eyes blue. Margaret noticed now. Pale blue like faded calico, like sky washed thin by too much sun, stayed fixed on Margaret's face with an intensity that seemed too old for such a small child. "That's Lily," Thomas said from behind her, his voice losing some of its hardness. "She don't talk much anymore. Not since—" He stopped, swallowed hard, his throat moving visibly. "Not since Ma and Pa?" Margaret nodded. She understood that silence. Some griefs were too big for words, too heavy to carry in something as small as language. She held out a biscuit to Lily, keeping her hand steady and still. The girl looked at it, looked at Margaret's face, looked at the biscuit again. Then she reached out, not for the food, but for the fabric of Margaret's dress. Her small fingers touched the faded blue calico, rubbed it between her thumb and forefinger like someone testing the quality of cloth at a mercantile, feeling for something only she could understand. "Soft," Lily whispered. The word was barely audible, more breath than voice. The first word Margaret had heard her speak. Margaret's chest went tight, like a fist closing around something fragile. She did not move, did not pull away. Lily's hand traveled up from the fabric to Margaret's arm, then to her shoulder. Then, before Margaret could react or prepare herself, the girl had crawled off the cot and climbed into her lap. Small arms wrapped around Margaret's neck, a small body pressed against her chest, curling into her like a kitten seeking warmth on a cold night. Like something that had been lost and was finally finding its way home. Lily's hair smelled of dust and wood smoke, and something underneath that was just child. That particular scent of innocence that no amount of hardship could quite erase. Margaret's arms closed around the girl. The motion was automatic, instinctive, something her body remembered even though she had never held a child of her own, had never been given the chance to be a mother, had buried that hope so deep she thought it was gone forever. She looked up and found Thomas watching her. His face had changed. The suspicion was still there, still guarding the door behind his eyes. But underneath it was something else now. Something raw and desperate and terrified. The face of a boy who had been trying so hard to be a man that he had forgotten he was still just a child himself. "You staying?" Samuel asked through a mouthful of biscuit, crumbs falling from his lips as he spoke. "At the ranch. Are you staying?" Margaret opened her mouth to answer, and found she did not know what to say, because Lily's arms had tightened around her neck, and the child's breath was warm and steady against her collar. And somewhere deep in the hollow of her chest, something had stirred to life that she had buried so long ago she had forgotten it was there. She looked down at the small head pressed against her shoulder, felt the flutter of Lily's heartbeat against her own, quick and light as a sparrow's wings. When was the last time anyone needed me for anything at all? The kitchen became Margaret's territory. It happened slowly, the way dawn creeps across a valley, not all at once, but in small movements so quiet you did not notice until you looked up and found the darkness gone. First it was the bread. Margaret woke before sunrise, on her 5th day at the ranch, her body still tuned to the rhythms of farm life that had shaped her since childhood. She found herself standing in the kitchen with flour on her hands, before she had made a conscious decision to be there. The dough came together under her palms, the way it always had, warm and yielding, alive with the yeast Rosa had given her from the crock by the window. The smell of it baking filled the house. She did not realize what she had done until she heard footsteps in the hallway, slow and uncertain, and turned to find Silas Thornton standing in the kitchen doorway. His hat was in his hands, his silver-streaked hair uncombed, his face carrying an expression she could not quite read in the early morning light. He looked at the bread rising golden on the counter, looked at her, said nothing for a long moment. Then he sat down at the kitchen table. "Room for one more." His voice was quiet, rough with sleep, or something deeper. Margaret nodded, set a plate before him, poured coffee from the pot Rosa kept warming on the back of the stove, the dark liquid steaming as it hit the cup. They ate in silence. The bread was good. She knew it was good, could taste the quality in the way the crust crackled under her teeth and the inside stayed soft and warm. But Silas did not comment on it. He simply ate, slow and steady, like a man who had forgotten that food could be anything other than fuel to keep a body working. The children came next. Thomas appeared first, hovering in the doorway the way he always did, watching and waiting and measuring with those 2 old eyes. Behind him, Samuel clutched his older brother's shirt with one hand, his gaze fixed on the kitchen table where the bread sat steaming beside a crock of butter Rosa had churned the day before. "There's plenty," Margaret said. She did not look at them directly, had learned already that Thomas startled like a wild horse if you paid him too much attention too fast. "Sit down if you want." They sat. Lily climbed into the chair beside Margaret without being asked, her small body pressed close, her fingers reaching for a piece of bread that Margaret tore off and handed to her. Silas watched this. His coffee cup paused halfway to his mouth. Something shifted in his face, a crack in stone. There and gone so quick Margaret might have imagined it if she had not been looking right at him. "Children been eating in the bunkhouse," he said, not a question. "They eat in the kitchen now," Margaret replied. She kept her voice even, plain. "The way you state a fact that does not need defending." "Easier for Rosa. Easier for everyone." Silas looked at her for a long moment. His eyes were gray in the morning light. the color of weathered fence posts, of storm clouds building over mountains. Then he nodded once, short and sharp, and went back to his bread. That was how it began. The sheets came off the parlor furniture a week later, one piece at a time. Because Margaret had learned that this house did not respond well to sudden changes. That it needed to be coaxed back to life, like a garden gone too long without tending. She started with the smallest chair, a lady's chair, delicate and fine, upholstered in faded green velvet that had once been beautiful, and dragged it into the kitchen, where the light was good, and the warmth from the stove made the room feel like something worth staying in. Lily claimed it immediately, sat in it with her legs tucked beneath her, her blue eyes following Margaret's every movement as she worked. The next day, Margaret uncovered the settee. The day after that, the writing desk by the parlor window. Rosa said nothing about any of this, but Margaret noticed that the older woman had started humming while she worked a low, tuneless sound that filled the silences between tasks, a sound that might have been contentment or might have been hope, if such things could have a sound. The first time Lily laughed, they were making pie. Margaret had handed the child a scrap of leftover dough to play with, expecting nothing, and Lily had shaped it into something that might have been a horse or might have been a dog. Impossible to tell with the lumpy proportions and crooked legs, and held it up for Margaret to examine with an expression of serious pride. Margaret made a grave face, studied the dough creature with exaggerated attention, turning it this way and that in the light from the window. "Well now," she said slowly, "that is the finest horse dog I have ever seen in all my born days." Lily's laugh was small and rusty, like a door that had not been opened in years, the hinges stiff from disuse. But it filled the kitchen, bounced off the walls, echoed into the hallway where Samuel heard it and came running to see what had happened, his bare feet slapping against the wooden floor. Margaret looked up and found Silas standing in the doorway again. He was watching Lily. His face had gone pale beneath the weathered tan, and his hand gripped the doorframe hard enough that the knuckles showed white through the skin. Then he turned and walked away. His boots sounded heavy on the floorboards, retreating toward the back of the house, toward the study where he spent most of his hours alone with his ledgers and his silence and whatever memories he could not put down. Margaret did not follow him. She understood. Some sounds carried too much weight to bear all at once. A child's laughter in a house that had forgotten what laughter sounded like, that was not a small thing. That was an earthquake. The apple pie came together under her hands that afternoon. Rosa had shared the recipe without being asked, had simply appeared at Margaret's elbow while she was measuring flour, and recited the ingredients in her quiet, steady voice. Lard for the crust, worked in with cold fingers until it crumbled like sand. Brown sugar and cinnamon for the filling. The spices sharp and sweet in Margaret's nose. Smelling like autumn back in Ohio. Like her mother's kitchen before everything went wrong. Apples from the root cellar, stored from last year's harvest. Their skins wrinkled, but their flesh still firm and tart. "Senora Catherine's recipe," Rosa had said, her voice careful. Nothing more. Margaret baked the pie that evening. Let it cool on the windowsill while the children ate their supper of beans and cornbread. The smell of cinnamon and browned sugar drifting through the kitchen. Like a ghost of something that used to be, she cut a generous slice and set it on a plate. The filling oozing thick and golden where the knife had passed through. She found Silas on the front porch, sitting in one of the rocking chairs, staring out at the mountains going dark against the sky. The evening had turned cool, and she could see his breath misting in the air, small clouds that formed and vanished with each exhale. She set the plate on the small table beside him. The fork clinked against the china. She did not speak, turned to go back inside. "Margaret." She stopped. Her hand rested on the doorframe. It was the first time he had said her name. Silas looked at the pie. His hands did not move toward it. He stared at the slice the way a man stares at a letter he is afraid to open, knowing that whatever is inside will change things in ways that cannot be undone. Then he picked up the fork, cut off a small piece, put it in his mouth. He chewed slowly, swallowed. His throat worked hard, the muscles moving visibly beneath the weathered skin, like the food was fighting to go down. He did not speak, did not look at her, but he took another bite, and another, and another, until the plate was empty and nothing remained but crumbs and a smear of golden filling. Margaret sat down in the rocking chair beside him. The wood creaked beneath her weight. A comfortable sound, familiar. Crickets had started singing somewhere in the grass beyond the porch, their chorus rising and falling in waves that filled the cooling air. The silence between them was different now, not empty, full of things waiting to be said, gathering like clouds before rain. "Catherine used to make that pie." Silas's voice came out rough, scraped raw, like words dragged across gravel. "William would try to eat half of it before supper if she let him." "She never let him." A pause. "But she'd sneak him a slice anyway, when she thought I wasn't looking. I always knew. Never said nothing." Margaret did not move, did not speak. Let the words come at their own pace, in their own time. Fever took them both. Same week. He was looking at the mountains, but his eyes were seeing something else. Somewhere else. Some other time that existed now only in memory. Buried them under the cottonwood out back, side by side, the way they would have wanted. "I'm sorry," Margaret said. The words felt small, inadequate. A thimble trying to hold an ocean. "Figured if I kept the house quiet, wouldn't hurt so much." Silas shook his head slowly, the movement heavy with 3 years of learning how wrong he had been. "Turns out quiet just makes it louder." The crickets sang on. A horse nickered somewhere in the barn, the sound carrying soft through the evening air. The rocking chair beneath Margaret creaked again as she shifted, trying to ease the ache in her back. "I know something about being left behind," she said quietly, the words coming before she could think better of them. "The wagon train. They called me dead weight, said they couldn't afford to keep me on." Silas turned to look at her for the first time. In the fading light, his face was all shadows and angles, hard to read, but his eyes had something in them that had not been there before. "Folks say all kinds of things that ain't true," he said. Something loosened in Margaret's chest. A knot she had been carrying so long she had forgotten it was there. They sat together as the darkness gathered around the porch and the stars began appearing overhead, one by one, like promises being made to a sky that had learned not to expect them. They didn't need to say nothing else. Sometimes just sitting together was enough. The next morning, Margaret found a bolt of fabric on the kitchen table, still wrapped in brown paper from the mercantile in town. No note, no explanation, just the paper and the string and whatever was inside. She picked it up, felt the weight of it in her hands, pulled the string loose and folded back the paper. Yellow calico, soft and fine, the color of sunshine and buttercups and things that grew toward the light. Enough fabric to make a dress for a little girl. And underneath it, folded separate, another piece, blue calico, deeper, richer, Enough for a woman's dress. Margaret's hands began to tremble. When did he go to town? And why would a man who barely speaks buy fabric for a woman he's known less than 2 weeks? The wagon rattled over the rutted road toward town, each jolt sending a sharp ache through Margaret's lower back. She gripped the wooden seat with both hands, her knuckles white against the weathered planks, trying to brace herself against the constant jarring. Rosa sat beside her, handling the reins with the easy confidence of a woman who had made this trip more times than she could count. The morning sun had already climbed high enough to burn the dew off the grass, and the air smelled of dust and sage and the faint sweetness of wildflowers blooming somewhere just out of sight along the roadside. "First time going to town since you came," Rosa said. Not a question, just a statement of fact, laid out plain. Margaret nodded. Her stomach had been tight since breakfast, a hard knot sitting just below her ribs that had nothing to do with hunger. "Don't pay them no mind," Rosa continued, her dark eyes fixed on the road ahead, watching for ruts and rocks that could catch a wheel wrong. "Townfolk got nothing better to do than flap their gums about other people's business." The words were meant as comfort. They did not help. Main Street appeared around the final bend in the road, a collection of wooden buildings clustered along a wide dirt thoroughfare. Hitching posts lined with horses, switching their tails against the flies. People moving between the general mercantile and the feed store and the small white church standing at the far end like a sentinel. Margaret could see women in calico dresses and sunbonnets, men in work clothes and dusty hats, children chasing each other through the gaps between buildings with the careless energy of youth. Normal? Ordinary? A town like dozens of others she had passed through in her 32 years of living? But her hands were trembling anyway, and she pressed them flat against her thighs to hide it. Rosa pulled the wagon to a stop in front of the mercantile. The building was larger than the others on the street, its tall windows cluttered with displays of fabric bolts and tin cookware and tools, arranged to catch the eye of anyone passing by. "I'll get the flour and salt," Rosa said, setting the brake and wrapping the reins around the post. "You pick out thread for Lily's dress, yellow, to match the calico. Should be on the wall near the back of the store, by the notions." Margaret climbed down from the wagon seat. Her legs felt unsteady beneath her, weak in a way that had nothing to do with the long ride over rough road. She smoothed her dress the same faded blue calico she had been wearing when Silas found her, washed now and mended at the elbows, but still showing its age, and walked toward the mercantile's open door. The smell hit her first when she stepped inside. Pickle brine and sawdust and the musty sweetness of stored grain and dried beans, all mixed together into something that was neither pleasant nor unpleasant. Just the particular scent of a general store in a small western town. The mercantile was dim after the brightness of the street, and Margaret blinked as her eyes struggled to adjust to the change. Shelves lined every wall, crowded with goods. Barrels of crackers and flour sat along one side. Ropes of dried tobacco hung from hooks near the counter. Women stood near the fabric display at the back wall. 3 of them, clustered together like hens at a feed trough, their bonnets nearly touching as they leaned close. Their voices dropped to whispers the moment Margaret crossed the threshold. She felt their eyes on her, felt the weight of their assessment measuring her size, her plain face, her worn dress with its patched elbows and fraying hem. She had felt that weight before. In every town she had ever passed through, in every room she had ever entered. The quick inventory of her faults, tallied and judged and found wanting. Margaret kept her gaze forward, walked toward the back of the store where the thread was supposed to be, her boots loud on the plank floor in the sudden quiet. The whispers followed her like flies following a horse. She could not hear the words clearly. Did not need to. The tone was enough, that particular pitch of female voices engaged in the ancient work of judgment, slicing a stranger into pieces, with nothing but syllables and sidelong glances, and the small cruelties that cost nothing to give. Margaret found the thread. Rows of wooden spools lined up neat on pegs against the wall, organized by color from white to black, with everything between. She reached for a spool of yellow that looked like it might match the calico waiting back at the ranch. "Well?" A voice cut through the whispers, loud enough to carry clear across the store. Silas Thornton always did collect strays. Margaret's hand froze on the spool. "Martha, hush." Another voice, softer, making some attempt at discretion that fooled no one. "What? It's the plain truth." The first voice Martha continued without lowering her volume one bit. "First those orphan children nobody else wanted, and now this, though I must say this one's bigger than most of his charity cases." Laughter, polite, thin, sharp as broken glass dragged across bare skin. Margaret's face burned. Her throat closed up tight, making it hard to swallow, hard to breathe. She stared at the wall of thread, at the neat rows of colored spools, arranged so careful, and willed her hands to stop their shaking. The door of the mercantile creaked open behind her. Boots on the wooden floor. Heavy, deliberate steps that she recognized even before she turned around. "Mrs. Margaret." She turned. Silas Thornton stood just inside the doorway, his good town hat in his hands, his gray eyes finding hers across the length of the store. He was wearing a clean shirt she had not seen before and his best wool vest, as if he had dressed for something important. The whispers stopped dead. Silas walked toward her, his boots loud and unhurried on the planks, each step deliberate. He did not look at the women clustered by the fabric, did not acknowledge their existence with so much as a glance. His attention was fixed entirely on Margaret, as if she were the only person in the room worth seeing. "Found that fabric you wanted for Lily's new dress?" He held up a bolt of something pale calico, she realized, printed with tiny flowers in soft pink and cream. "This the one?" Margaret looked at the fabric. She had not asked for any fabric, had not spoken to him about making anything new for Lily, but she understood what he was doing, understood it clear as day. "Yes," she said. Her voice came out steadier than she had any right to expect. "That's the one exactly." Silas nodded. He walked past her to the counter at the front of the store, set the bolt of fabric down beside the cash register, and pulled coins from his vest pocket. Paid without asking the price, without haggling, without any of the usual back and forth that went on in country stores. Tucked the fabric under one arm and turned back to Margaret. "Anything else you need while we're here?" She shook her head. "Then let's get on home." He offered her his other arm, the gesture as formal and deliberate as if they were walking into a church social, as if the whole town was watching and he wanted them to see exactly what he thought of their whispers and their judgment. Margaret took his arm, felt the solid warmth of him through the cotton of his sleeve. Let him lead her past the women with their mouths hanging open like landed fish, past the pickle barrels and the stacks of flour sacks and the bins of nails and screws, out through the door into the bright morning sunlight. Rosa had already loaded their supplies into the back of the wagon. She looked at Silas, looked at Margaret on his arm, and said nothing. But the corner of her mouth twitched in what might have been the beginning of a smile. Silas helped Margaret up onto the wagon seat. His hands were gentle but firm on her elbow, steadying her as she climbed up, not letting go until she was settled safe on the wooden bench. "Thomas rode out to find me," he said, answering the question she had not yet asked. "Rosa sent him when you left this morning. Said you might could use some backup in town." "I was handling it fine," Margaret said. The words came out sharper than she intended. "I know you were—" Silas swung up onto his own horse, a different animal than the bay gelding, this one, a tall sorrel that one of the ranch hands must have brought to town for him. "But you shouldn't have to handle it alone." "That ain't right." They rode in silence for a while, the wagon creaking over the ruts, the horses' hooves thudding soft against the packed dirt of the road. The town fell away behind them, shrinking smaller and smaller until it was just a smudge of brown and gray against the wide horizon. "Folks in town got small minds," Silas said finally, his voice carrying clear across the space between them. He did not look at her as he spoke, kept his eyes on the road ahead. "Don't mean you gotta shrink yourself down to fit inside them." Margaret's hands unclenched in her lap. She looked down at them, red-knuckled from work, calloused across the palms, the hands of a woman who had spent her whole life being useful to everyone and wanted by no one. "That woman," she said slowly. "Mrs. Harmon? What she called me, I heard every word she said." Silas's jaw tightened, the muscle jumping beneath the weathered skin. "Don't make a bit of it true." The wagon jolted hard over a deep rut in the road. Margaret grabbed the seat to catch herself, and her fingers brushed against the bolt of pink calico that Silas had placed beside her on the bench, soft under her touch, fine woven, the kind of fabric a woman would use to make a dress for a little girl she loved. "You didn't have to do that," she said quietly. So quiet the words almost got lost in the creak of the wagon wheels. "Come to town." The fabric, standing up like that in front of everyone. Silas was silent for a long moment. The sorrel's ears flicked back toward the sound of Margaret's voice, then forward again toward the road. "Reckon I wanted to?" he said finally. The words came out rough, uncertain, like a man walking across a frozen pond and not quite sure the ice would hold his weight. Margaret looked at him at the set of his shoulders against the morning sky, at the silver threading through his dark hair, at the way his hands held the reins with an easy competence born of years of practice. This man who had lost everyone he loved and somehow still found room to take in children nobody else wanted. Who had found her dying slow on a dusty road and brought her home without asking anything in return. Who had walked into a store full of gossiping women and stood beside her like she was worth standing beside. The wagon crested a small rise, and the ranch appeared in the valley below the house with its wraparound porch, the big barn, the corrals where horses moved lazy in the midday warmth. Home, Margaret thought, and the word did not feel strange anymore. Then she saw Thomas running toward them from the direction of the house, his thin legs pumping hard, his face twisted with something that looked like fear, his voice carrying thin and high across the distance. "Mr. Thornton? Mr. Thornton, come quick." The boy's shout cracked in the middle, breaking like a voice that had not yet learned to be a man's. "It's Lily. She fell in the creek, and now she's shaking, and she won't stop, and Rosa says to hurry." Lily's skin burned under Margaret's palm like a stove lid left too long over hot coals. The child lay curled in the narrow bed in Margaret's room, her small body wrapped in quilts that did nothing to stop the violent trembling. Her face had gone an angry red, flushed dark with fever, and her hair lay plastered to her forehead in wet strings. Each breath came shallow and ragged, a terrible rasping sound that filled the quiet room. Margaret wrung out a cloth in the basin of well water beside the bed. The water had already gone warm from the heat coming off Lily's body. She would need to fetch more soon, colder water. But she could not bring herself to leave the child's side even for the few minutes that would take. How long was she in the creek? Margaret kept her voice steady, calm. even though her hands wanted to shake so bad she could barely hold the cloth. Thomas stood in the doorway, his face pale as buttermilk, his eyes too large in his thin face. I don't know. I was watching Samuel. He was trying to catch crawdads, and I was making sure he didn't fall in, and I turned around and Lily was already in the water up to her chest. His voice cracked, broke apart. The creek ain't deep, but she slipped on the rocks and went all the way under, and by the time I got to her she was shaking and crying, and I carried her back fast as I could, but that's enough. Margaret laid the cool cloth across Lily's burning forehead. The child whimpered, but did not open her eyes. It's not your fault, Thomas. Not one bit. Now go find Rosa and tell her I need willow bark tea. She'll know what to do. Tell her to boil the water fresh. Thomas ran. His footsteps pounded down the hallway, loud and desperate, and Margaret heard the back door slam hard against its frame. Then silence, broken only by Lily's labored breathing and the creak of the old house settling around them. She looked down at Lily's face, at the blue shadows pooling under her closed eyes, at the way her small chest heaved with each struggle for air, and felt something cold settle deep into the pit of her stomach. She had seen fever before, had sat beside her mother's bed for 3 weeks straight while the sickness burned through her, had watched the life drain out of a woman who had been strong enough to birth children and bury 2 of them, and work a farm from before dawn to after dark. Had held her mother's hand at the end when there was nothing left to do but wait. Fever was not always a death sentence, but it could be. It could come quick and brutal and take everything you loved while you sat there, helpless, useless, unable to do anything but watch. The bedroom door creaked behind her. Margaret did not turn around. She did not need to. She had felt his presence in the doorway before she heard him breathe, before his boots made any sound on the worn floorboards. How bad? Silas's voice was barely above a whisper, rough and raw. Bad enough. Margaret dipped the cloth in the water again, wrung it out, pressed it gentle against Lily's flushed cheeks, her neck, her tiny wrists where the pulse fluttered fast and weak beneath the skin. The chill from the creek water, her body's fighting hard. Silas moved into the room. His footsteps were slow, heavy. The walk of a man approaching something he did not want to see but could not turn away from. He stopped at the foot of the iron bed and looked down at Lily. And the sound that came out of him was not quite a word. His face had gone the color of old bone, pale beneath the weathered tan. The lines around his eyes cutting deep like wounds. I can't. The words caught in his throat, strangled. He swallowed hard, the muscles of his neck working visible beneath the skin. Tried again. I can't do this again. I can't bury another child. I can't. Margaret looked up at him, saw the way his hands gripped the iron footboard until the knuckles went white and bloodless, saw the tremor running through his shoulders, the crack spreading through the wall he had built around himself, the man coming apart at the seams right in front of her. Then we sit here till she's better, Margaret said. Her voice came out steady, matter of fact. The voice of a woman who had learned long ago that falling apart was a luxury she could not afford. Simple as that. We sit here, and we fight, and we don't stop till the sun comes up. She did not know if she believed it. Did not know if believing made any difference at all when fever had its claws sunk deep into a child's body. But she said it anyway, because saying it was better than saying nothing. And because the man standing at the foot of the bed looked like he was about to shatter into 1,000 pieces that could never be put back together. Silas pulled the wooden chair from the corner of the room and set it on the opposite side of the narrow bed. He sat down heavily, like his legs had finally given out beneath him, like he had been carrying a weight too long and could not hold it anymore. His eyes fixed on Lily's face and did not move, did not blink, did not look away. Rosa came with the willow bark tea, bitter and dark, steeped strong in water just off the boil. Margaret lifted Lily's head gentle with one hand and trickled the liquid between the child's cracked lips. A few drops at a time, wiping away what dribbled down her chin. Lily swallowed weakly, coughed, swallowed again. Outside the window, the sun slid down behind the mountains. The light in the room shifted from gold to gray to the deep blue of early evening. Margaret trimmed the wick on the oil lamp beside the bed, added more kerosene from the can Rosa had brought. Watched the flame grow steady and strong. An owl called somewhere in the darkness outside, a low, mournful sound that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. The hours crawled past like years. Margaret changed the cloths over and over, replaced the water when it grew too warm, brewed more tea when the cup ran empty. Her back ached fierce from bending over the bed. Her eyes burned from the strain of watching, waiting, looking for any sign of change, any hint that the fever might be turning. Silas did not move from his chair, did not speak, just sat there with his hands clasped tight between his knees, staring at Lily's face like a man watching a ship go down in a storm and knowing he could not swim, could not save it, could not do anything but watch it sink. Somewhere past midnight, when the lamp had burned low and the owl had gone silent, and the only sounds were Lily's ragged breathing and the occasional pop of wood settling in the stove, Silas began to talk. Catherine was afraid of storms. His voice came out of the darkness, unexpected, rough as sandpaper dragged across raw wood. Thunder would wake her up shaking, and she'd lie there rigid in the bed until it passed. I used to hold her hand, tell her stories, anything to keep her mind off the noise outside. Margaret said nothing, kept her eyes on Lily, her hands busy with the cloth, letting the words come however they needed to come. William was scared of the dark, could not sleep without a candle burning on the table by his bed. Catherine used to fuss about it something terrible, said he'd burn the whole house down one of these nights if we weren't careful. A sound that might have been a laugh, might have been a sob, but she always lit that candle for him anyway. Every single night. The lamp flickered. Shadows danced across the walls, stretched and twisted into shapes that looked almost human before dissolving back into nothing. The fever came on so quick we didn't have time to understand what was happening. Silas's voice cracked, and he paused, drew a breath that shuddered in his chest. Catherine first, then William, just 2 days later. I sat right here in this very room, right beside this bed, and I watched them both go, held their hands, told them stories, prayed every prayer I knew and made up some new ones. None of it mattered. Not one bit of it made any difference at all. Margaret looked up at him across Lily's still form. His face was wet, tears tracking down his weathered cheeks and dripping off his jaw onto his clasped hands. She had not heard him crying, had not seen him move to wipe his eyes, but the tears were there, falling steady and silent as rain. I thought I was being punished, he said, his voice barely a whisper now. For something I did, something I didn't do, something I should have done different. Every day since they went into the ground, I've been waiting for the Lord to finish the job, take whatever was left of me. Because what was the point of going on? What was there left to go on for? Margaret set down the cloth, reached across the narrow bed, took his hand in both of hers. His fingers closed around hers and gripped hard, hard enough to hurt, hard enough to leave bruises. She did not pull away. "It ain't punishment," she said quietly, her voice low and steady in the dim room. "Just life being cruel. Doesn't mean anything except that we gotta keep going anyway. One breath at a time, 1 hour at a time, till it hurts a little bit less than it did the hour before." Silas looked at her. In the lamplight, his eyes were red-rimmed and raw, stripped of every defense he had built up over 3 years of silence and grief, and trying to survive inside a house full of ghosts. How the word came out broken, shattered. How do you keep going when everything you ever loved is in the ground? Margaret did not have an answer. She had asked herself the same question 1,000 times over. After her mother died slow and painful in that narrow bed back in Ohio, after her father drank himself into an early grave trying to forget, after the wagon train left her standing alone on a dusty road with nothing but a canvas bag and a tin cup, and the certain knowledge that nobody in the whole world would notice or care if she simply lay down and died. "I don't know," she said honestly. "You just do. Because the sun comes up whether you want it to or not, and the work needs doing. And somewhere out there somebody might need you even when you can't see how anybody ever could." Silas's grip on her hand tightened, then loosened. He did not let go. They sat like that through the long dark hours of the night, two people who had lost everything, holding hands across the bed of a child who was fighting to stay alive. The lamp burned low. Margaret trimmed the wick again, added more oil, watched the flames steady. The owl started calling again outside, and this time another owl answered from somewhere far away, their voices weaving together in the darkness, near dawn, when the first gray light was just beginning to creep around the edges of the calico curtains, yellow calico, the fabric Margaret had sewn into Lily's dress just the week before something changed. Lily's breathing eased. The terrible, ragged gasps softened into something deeper, more regular. The breathing of a child who was sleeping instead of a child who was drowning. Margaret pressed her palm flat against the small forehead and felt the heat beginning to fade, pulling back like a tide going out. "The fever's breaking," she whispered. Silas leaned forward in his chair. His free hand reached out and touched Lily's cheek, gentle as breath, gentle as prayer. His shoulders began to shake. No sound came out of him. Just his body shuddering with 3 years of grief and fear and desperate hope finally breaking through the walls he had built to contain it all. 3 years of holding it in, holding it down. Trying to survive inside a prison he had made out of silence. Margaret did not tell him it would be all right. It had not been all right before. And pretending would not make it so now. She rose from her chair, moved around the foot of the bed to where he sat, lowered herself onto the arm of his chair, and put her hand on his back, between his shoulder blades, where the muscles were knotted tight as rope. Kept it there. The dawn light crept in stronger now, painting the room in shades of gold and rose. Outside. A rooster crowed somewhere near the barn. A horse nickered soft. The world was waking up and carrying on the way it always did. Indifferent to the small battles being fought in quiet rooms behind closed doors. Silas's shoulders stopped their shaking by slow degrees. He drew a long breath, unsteady, ragged at the edges, wiped his face with the back of his free hand, the gesture rough and almost angry. When he looked up at Margaret, his eyes were red but clear. Something had broken open behind them, or maybe something had finally closed. Some wound that had been bleeding for 3 years finally starting to heal. "Thank you," he said. His voice was hoarse. scraped raw. "Nothing to thank me for." Margaret kept her hand on his back, steady, warm. "That's just what family does." The word hung in the air between them like a held breath. Neither of them reached up to take it back. Neither of them looked away. Lily stirred in the bed. Her pale eyelids fluttered, opened halfway. Her blue eyes were cloudy with exhaustion and the fading edges of fever. But they were seeing, tracking, alive. "Aunt Maggie?" Her voice came out thin as old paper, barely a whisper. Margaret's breath caught hard in her chest. "Aunt Maggie." The child had never called her that before, had never called her anything except you or ma'am or sometimes nothing at all. "I'm right here, little one." Margaret moved back to the bedside, took Lily's small hand in hers. The fingers that wrapped around her own were weak but warm, alive, holding on. "I'm right here. I'm not going anywhere." Lily's eyes searched her face, looking for something, some answer to a question the child could not quite put into words. "Promise?" The whisper was almost too faint to hear. "Promise you won't go away? Promise you'll stay?" Margaret looked across at Silas. He was watching her, his face open in a way she had never seen before. No walls, no defenses, just the raw question written there, plain as words on a page. She looked back down at Lily, at this small child who had lost everything she ever knew and was asking now for the one thing Margaret had never been able to give anyone in her whole life: a promise to stay. "Can I make that promise? Can I be what these children need? What this man needs when everyone I've ever loved has either left me behind or ended up in the ground?" 3 weeks had passed since the fever broke. Margaret stood at the kitchen stove in the early morning light, stirring a pot of oatmeal with one hand while the other rested on Lily's head. The child sat on a stool beside her, still thin from the sickness but growing stronger every day, her small fingers busy braiding scraps of yellow ribbon into something she called a horse, but which looked more like a tangled bird's nest. The kitchen smelled of coffee and wood smoke and the faint sweetness of molasses warming in a tin on the back of the stove. Sunlight poured through the window above the sink, catching the dust motes that danced in the air and turning them to flecks of gold. "Aunt Maggie." Thomas appeared in the doorway, his face flushed from running, his hair sticking up in 3 different directions. "Samuel took my fishing pole again and he won't give it back. And I already asked him twice like you said." Margaret set down her stirring spoon, wiped her hands on her apron. "Did you ask him proper? Or did you holler at him like a mule skinner?" Thomas's face went red. "Maybe I hollered a little." "Then go back and ask him again, without the hollering this time. You're the oldest, Thomas. That means you got to learn how to settle things with words before you settle them with fists." The boy's mouth opened to argue, then closed. He stood there looking at her for a long moment, something shifting behind his eyes, the slow recognition that she was not going to fix this for him, that she expected him to be better than he thought he could be. "Yes, ma'am," he said finally, and turned to go. "Thomas," he stopped in the doorway. "If he still won't give it back after you've asked proper, come find me, but try first. You might surprise yourself." The boy nodded once, sharp, and disappeared down the hallway. A moment later, Margaret heard the back door open and close, heard his voice calling out to his brother across the yard, firm but not angry, the way she had been teaching him for weeks now. Lily tugged at Margaret's apron. "Is Thomas in trouble?" "No, little one. He's just learning." "Learning what?" Margaret looked down at the child. Lily had put on weight since the fever, her cheeks filling out, the sharp angles of hunger and fear softening into something that looked almost healthy. The yellow dress Margaret had made for her was already getting tight across the shoulders, straining at the seams. She would need to let it out soon or make a new one entirely. "Learning how to be part of a family," Margaret said. Rosa appeared in the kitchen doorway, a basket of eggs balanced on her hip, her gray-streaked hair escaping from its pins the way it always did by mid-morning. She looked at Margaret standing at the stove, at Lily perched on her stool, at the pot of oatmeal bubbling steady and warm. "You changed this place, Señora." Her voice was quiet, matter-of-fact. The voice of someone stating something so obvious it barely needed saying. "Changed him too." Margaret did not ask who she meant, did not need to. "The house just needed people in it," she said. "That's all it was?" Rosa shook her head slowly. The movement weighted with something that might have been disagreement, or might have been wonder. "No. The house needed you. There's a difference. And it's not a small one." She set the basket of eggs on the counter and walked back out toward the chicken coop, leaving Margaret alone with Lily and the smell of oatmeal and the weight of words she still did not know quite how to carry. The morning passed in the ordinary rhythms that had become as familiar as breathing. Margaret hung laundry on the line behind the house, the wet sheets snapping sharp in the mountain breeze. She sat with Samuel at the kitchen table while he practiced his letters on a slate board, his tongue poking out between his teeth as he concentrated on making the curves and lines come out right. She braided Lily's hair with the yellow ribbon cut from dress scraps, tying it in a bow that the child ran to show Rosa before Margaret had even finished smoothing down the loose ends. Ordinary. Simple. The kind of day Margaret had spent her whole life watching other women have, never quite believing she might have one for herself. Near noon, Thomas came bursting through the kitchen door, but this time his face was different, bright, excited. The fishing pole was clutched in his hand, his own pole, the one Samuel had taken, and his brother was right behind him, grinning wide. "Mr. Thornton's back from town," Thomas announced, "and he's got someone with him." Margaret dried her hands on her apron and walked to the front porch. Silas was riding up the drive on his bay gelding, moving at an easy walk. Beside him, mounted on a gray mare that looked hired from the livery stable, rode a woman Margaret recognized from the mercantile, Mrs. Harmon. Margaret's stomach clenched tight, her hands curled into fists at her sides before she could stop them, the nails digging into her palms. Silas dismounted and helped Mrs. Harmon down from her horse. The woman looked uncomfortable, her eyes darting around the ranch yard like a rabbit looking for somewhere to bolt. Her gloved hands smoothing her traveling skirt over and over in a nervous gesture that seemed beyond her control. Margaret. Silas walked toward the porch, Mrs. Harmon trailing a few steps behind him like a child being led to punishment. "Mrs. Harmon rode out from town. She has something she wants to say to you." Margaret did not move from where she stood, did not speak, just waited on the porch with her arms crossed over her chest, watching the woman who had called her a stray in front of half the town. Mrs. Harmon stopped at the bottom of the porch steps. She looked up at Margaret, and her face was a complicated map of things warring against each other. Embarrassment and reluctance, and something that might, if you squinted and were feeling generous, be the beginning of shame. She stopped, cleared her throat, started again, the words coming out stiff and rehearsed. "What I said at the mercantile, about you being about Mr. Thornton collecting." She could not seem to make herself finish the sentence. Margaret waited. Let the silence stretch. "It was unkind of me," Mrs. Harmon finally managed. "I had no cause to speak that way about someone I don't even know, someone I never took the trouble to know." The quiet between them filled with the sound of wind in the grass and a horse stamping in the corral, and the distant shout of Thomas calling something to his brother. "Is that all?" Margaret's voice came out flat as a plank. Mrs. Harmon's face flushed dark red. "I came all the way out here to apologize. I think the least you could do is accept it." Margaret came down the porch steps, one at a time, slow and deliberate, until she was standing on level ground with Mrs. Harmon, close enough to see the beads of sweat on the woman's upper lip, close enough to smell the lavender water she had dabbed behind her ears. "You called me a stray in front of a store full of people. You laughed at me. Your friends laughed at me. And now you want me to make you feel better about it by saying all's forgiven so you can ride home with a clear conscience." Mrs. Harmon's mouth opened, closed, opened again like a fish pulled sudden from water. "I just thought that since I came all this way, you thought you'd ride out here with Mr. Thornton watching, say some pretty words you practiced on the way, and go home feeling like you'd done your Christian duty for the week." Margaret kept her voice steady, controlled, even though something hot and tight was building behind her ribs. "That's not how apologies work, Mrs. Harmon. That's not how they work at all." She turned to go back inside the house. "Wait." Mrs. Harmon's voice had changed, smaller now, the rehearsed stiffness gone out of it, replaced by something that sounded almost human. "Please, wait." Margaret stopped on the bottom step, did not turn around. "You're right." The words came out rough, reluctant, dragged up from somewhere deep. "I didn't want to come here. My husband made me. Said I'd shamed him in front of the whole town with my loose tongue, and I needed to make it right before Sunday service." Margaret turned slowly. Mrs. Harmon was looking at the ground now, her gloved hands twisted together at her waist, her shoulders hunched forward like she was trying to make herself smaller. "I've been saying cruel things about people my whole life. It's what my mother did before me, what her mother did before her. We sit in parlors and we pick people apart like chickens, and we never once think about what it feels like to be the one getting picked." She looked up, and her eyes were wet, her face blotchy. "I never thought about it. Not once. Not until I saw your face that day in the mercantile." Margaret said nothing, waited. "I've seen that face in my own mirror," Mrs. Harmon said quietly. "After my first husband died, and people whispered that I'd married again too quick. After I lost 2 babies, and the town women said maybe it was the Lord's judgment on me for something I'd done wrong." Her voice cracked. "I know what it feels like to be the one they're talking about. And I didn't like knowing I was the one who put that look on somebody else's face." The wind blew through the yard, stirring dust and carrying the smell of sage and horse and the distant promise of rain somewhere over the mountains. Margaret looked at this woman, this small, ordinary woman who had hurt her with nothing but words and laughter and the casual cruelty of people who had never learned to imagine themselves in someone else's skin. She looked at the genuine shame in Mrs. Harmon's red-rimmed eyes, the way her hands would not stop their nervous wringing. "There's coffee on the stove," Margaret said finally. "You rode a long way in the heat. Might as well have a cup before you make the trip back." Mrs. Harmon blinked, confusion and relief warring across her face. "You're inviting me inside after what I said. I'm offering you coffee. Don't make it into more than it is." But when Margaret turned toward the house, she held the door open behind her, and after a long moment, Mrs. Harmon walked through it. Silas found her on the front porch that evening. After Mrs. Harmon had gone and the children were fed and bathed and settled into their beds for the night, the sky had turned the color of old bruises, purple and orange and deep red, bleeding into black, and the first stars were beginning to show themselves against the coming dark. He sat down in the rocking chair beside her without asking. The wood creaked familiar under his weight. "That was a good thing you did today," he said. "With Mrs. Harmon." Margaret shook her head slowly. "I wanted to slam that door in her face. Wanted it so bad my hand was shaking. But you didn't." "No." She looked out at the mountains going dark against the sky. I don't rightly know why. They rocked in silence for a while. The crickets started up their evening chorus. And somewhere in the barn, a horse nickered soft and low, settling in for the night. Been thinking, Silas said finally. That's a dangerous habit for a man. The corner of his mouth twitched. Almost a smile, the closest thing to one she had seen from him yet. This house needs you. These children need you. He paused, drew a breath that seemed to cost him something. I need you. More than I know how to say proper. Margaret's hands went still on the arms of her rocking chair. I ain't asking for nothing fancy, Silas continued, his voice rough and uncertain, like a man walking across ice he was not sure would hold. No expectations beyond what you're willing to give. I'm just asking you to stay. Be part of this family. If you want to be. Margaret looked at the mountains, at the last light fading behind their peaks, looked at the house behind her, warm and lit, and full of children who called her Aunt Maggie, like it was the most natural thing in the world. Looked at this man who had lost everything that mattered to him, and was sitting here asking her to help him build something new from the wreckage. I spent my whole life waiting for someone to ask me that, she said quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. Never believed anybody would. Is that a yes? She turned to look at him. His face was open in the lamplight spilling from the window behind them, vulnerable in a way she had only ever seen once before that long night when Lily's fever broke and he wept in her arms, like a man finally letting go of something that had been killing him for years. Reckon it is, she said. Silas let out a breath that seemed to have been trapped in his chest for a very long time. His hand reached across the space between their chairs and found hers in the gathering darkness. They sat like that as the night came down around them. Two people who had seen enough hard times to know better than to face them alone anymore. The next morning, Margaret found an envelope sitting on the kitchen table when she came in to start the coffee. Her name was written on the front in handwriting she did not recognize, neat, formal, the kind of penmanship they used to teach in schoolhouses back east, each letter pressed careful and deep into the paper. She picked it up. The paper was thick, good quality, the kind that cost money. No return address. She broke the seal and pulled out the single sheet inside. Her eyes moved across the words. Once. Twice. A third time. Because her mind could not seem to make sense of what they were telling her. The letter slipped from her fingers and drifted down to the kitchen floor. To whom it may concern. We regret to inform you that the wagon company of which you were formerly a member has reached its destination in the California territories. During the course of the journey westward, 5 members of the company perished, 3 from fever and 2 from injuries sustained during a river crossing gone wrong. Among the deceased are Mr. Henry Colton, trail leader, and his wife Mrs. Sarah Colton, along with... Margaret's hands began to shake so hard she had to grip the edge of the table to keep standing. The wagon train that had left her behind. The people who had called her dead weight, who had looked at her and seen nothing worth keeping alive. They were dead. And she was here, in a warm kitchen, with a family who wanted her. If I had stayed with them, if they hadn't left me on that road, I would be dead too. They threw me away to save themselves, and they died anyway. And I'm still breathing. What am I supposed to do with that? Sunday morning arrived with all the chaos Margaret had learned to love. Thomas stood in front of the small mirror hanging in the hallway, fighting with his collar like it was a living creature bent on strangling him. His fingers fumbled with the button, slipped off the fabric, fumbled again. His face had gone red with frustration. His jaw set in the stubborn line she had come to know so well over these past months. Hold still, boy, Margaret moved behind him, her hands steady where his were clumsy. "The good Lord ain't gonna judge your neck, but your Aunt Maggie surely will if you tear that button clean off." Thomas made a sound halfway between a groan and a laugh, but he held still while she fastened the collar and smoothed down the shoulders of his jacket. The jacket was new, bought from the mercantile just last week, and already it was showing signs of the rough treatment a 10-year-old boy inflicted on everything he wore. There was a small tear near the left cuff, where he had caught it on a fence post, and the knees of his trousers were scuffed from kneeling in the dirt to examine a beetle Samuel had found. "Do I really have to wear all this?" Samuel appeared in the doorway behind them, tugging at his own collar with an expression of pure misery stretched across his freckled face. "Yes, you do. But why?" "Because we're going to church as a family, and families dress proper for church. That's just how it's done." The words settled into the narrow hallway, like a stone dropping into still water. Family. Margaret had said it without thinking, the way she said it every day now. And every time it surprised her a little less, felt a little more like the simple truth it had become. Lily came running from the bedroom at the back of the house, her yellow dress swirling around her knees, the ribbon in her hair already working itself loose from the bow Margaret had tied not 10 minutes ago. The child crashed into Margaret's legs and wrapped her thin arms around them with the fierce grip of someone who had learned too young how quickly the people you loved could disappear. "Aunt Maggie, I can't find my good shoes anywhere." "Did you look under the bed like I told you?" "Yes, ma'am." "Did you look in the kitchen?" Lily's small face scrunched up with confusion. "Why would my shoes be in the kitchen?" "Because that's where you kicked them off last night when you were helping Rosa shell peas for supper. You were swinging your feet under the table and they went flying. Remember?" The child's eyes went wide with sudden memory. She released Margaret's legs and went running toward the kitchen, her bare feet slapping loud against the wooden floorboards. Her voice calling back. "I remember now, they went under the stove." Margaret watched her go. Something warm and full and almost frightening in its intensity expanded in her chest, pressing against her ribs like it was trying to make room for itself in a space that had been empty for too many years. 3 months ago, no, closer to 4 now, she had been walking alone on a dusty road in the middle of nowhere, waiting for the end to find her. Now she was fastening collars and hunting for lost shoes and being called Aunt Maggie by 3 children who shared not one drop of her blood, but who had become hers anyway, in all the ways that truly mattered. Silas appeared at the far end of the hallway. He was wearing his good suit, the dark wool one that had hung unworn in the cedar chest for 3 years. The one Rosa had told her he had last put on for Catherine's funeral. The fabric was clean and pressed now, brushed free of dust and moth-wing dust, and it fit him well across the shoulders, made him look like the man he must have been before grief had hollowed him out. His gray eyes moved over Margaret, taking in her new dress, the blue calico she had sewn herself from the fabric he had bought her at the mercantile, the stitches neat and even, the fit better than anything she had worn in years. His gaze traveled up to her face, to her hair pinned up careful and proper, to her hands still resting on Thomas's shoulders. Something shifted in his expression, something that had been closed opened, just a little, just enough. "Ready?" he asked. "Almost. Lily's hunting for her shoes in the kitchen. That child would lose her own head if the good Lord hadn't attached it firm to her neck." Lily came running back clutching her shoes in both hands, a smear of ash across her cheek from digging under the stove. Margaret knelt down to help her put them on, wiping the ash away with the corner of her apron, tying the laces in double knots that might survive the walk to town without coming undone. They set out together down the road, all 5 of them. The morning was bright and clear, the sky stretched blue and endless overhead, the air carrying the smell of sage and dust and the faint sweetness of wildflowers blooming somewhere out of sight. Silas walked beside Margaret, and after a moment his arm came up, bent at the elbow, offering. She took it without hesitation, let her hand rest in the crook of his arm, felt the warmth of him through the wool of his jacket sleeve. The children ran ahead, their energy impossible to contain. Thomas was trying his best to maintain some dignity, walking with his shoulders squared and his chin up like a young man going to court a girl. But Samuel had already abandoned all pretense and was chasing a grasshopper through the tall grass beside the road. Lily skipped in circles around both her brothers, her yellow dress flashing bright in the morning sun, her laughter carrying back to Margaret and Silas on the light breeze. The town appeared around the last bend, and Margaret felt her stomach tighten the way it always did when she had to face people. But the feeling was different now. Smaller. Less sharp-edged. She had a hand to hold, and children calling her name. And that made all the difference in the world. Main Street was busy with Sunday traffic families walking toward the small white church at the end of the road. Wagons pulled up along the hitching posts, men in their good suits and women in their best dresses, children scrubbed clean and squirming in clothes they would shed the moment the service ended. People looked at them as they passed. Margaret felt the weight of their attention, the curiosity and the whispers and the sideways glances. She straightened her spine, lifted her chin, did not look down, did not shrink, did not try to make herself smaller to fit inside their narrow expectations. Silas's hand covered hers where it rested on his arm, warm and steady and present, an anchor holding her fast against the current. The church was small and plain, whitewashed boards and a simple steeple with a bell that hung silent now, waiting for the service to begin. The doors stood open wide, letting in the morning light and the smell of dust and sage and old hymnals. Margaret could see the wooden pews inside, worn smooth by generations of Sunday worship, and the simple altar at the front with its plain wooden cross. They walked up the steps together, through the open doors, into the dim coolness of the interior, where the light came through tall windows and fell in long rectangles across the plank floor. Heads turned throughout the congregation. Conversation stopped mid-sentence. Margaret felt the familiar prickle of being watched, being measured, being weighed on scales she could not see. Then Silas spoke, his voice carrying clear and strong through the quiet sanctuary. "Morning, Reverend the Thornton family is here." The Thornton family. Margaret's breath caught somewhere between her chest and her throat. The minister, a thin man with kind eyes behind wire-rimmed spectacles and a hairline that had retreated halfway up his scalp, smiled warm and genuine and stepped forward to greet them. "Welcome, Mr. Thornton, Mrs. Thornton." He nodded to each of the children in turn. "Thomas, Samuel, Miss Lily, we're glad to have you with us this fine morning. Mrs. Thornton." He had called her Mrs. Thornton, easy and natural, like it was simply the truth and nothing remarkable about it at all. Margaret looked at Silas. He was gazing straight ahead at the altar. But the muscle in his jaw was tight, and his hand where it held hers had tightened almost imperceptibly. He had known what he was doing when he said those words, had meant for the whole town to hear. They found seats in a pew near the middle of the church. The children filed in and settled Thomas, then Samuel, then Lily, who immediately climbed into Margaret's lap and refused to be dislodged, no matter how much Thomas whispered that she was too old for such baby behavior. The service began. The minister's voice rose and fell in the familiar rhythms of scripture and prayer, and the congregation sang hymns from battered books that smelled of dust and old paper and the hands of everyone who had held them before. Margaret heard the words, but did not truly listen to them. Her mind was elsewhere on the letter she had found on the kitchen table 3 days ago. The letter that had told her about the wagon train's fate, 5 people dead, fever, and a river crossing gone wrong. The trail leader who had called her dead weight and left her to die on a dusty road, his name had been on the list of the deceased. His wife, too. Gone now. Both of them. Buried somewhere in unmarked graves along a trail that no one would remember them walking. She had spent 3 days trying to understand what she was supposed to feel about that. Was it justice? That the people who had abandoned her had met such an end? Was it the Lord's doing? Some kind of divine punishment for their cruelty? Or was it just the random brutality of a world that did not care about fairness or deserving? That took and took and took, without reason or mercy, Margaret did not know. She was not sure knowing mattered. In the end, they were dead, and she was alive. And nothing she felt about that would change either fact. The service ended. The congregation rose and filed out into the bright morning, gathering in small groups on the church lawn to talk and gossip and catch up on the week's happenings. Margaret braced herself for the whispers, the sidelong glances, the polite cruelties of people with nothing better to occupy their small minds. But something had changed. Women approached her, not to whisper behind their hands, but to talk, face to face, eye to eye. Mrs. Patterson asked for her cornbread recipe, said she had heard Margaret's was the best in the county. Mrs. Williams wanted to know if she might be interested in joining the quilting circle that met Wednesday afternoons at the church hall. Even Mrs. Harmon still stiff, still awkward. Her eyes not quite able to meet Margaret's managed a small nod of acknowledgement as she passed. Margaret answered their questions, accepted their invitations, felt something loosening in her chest with each small exchange. Some knot she had tied so tight and carried so long that she had forgotten it was there. The walk home was slower than the walk to church had been. The children's energy had burned down to embers. And even Thomas was dragging his feet by the time the ranch came into view in the valley below. The house and barn and corrals laid out neat and familiar against the green-brown sweep of the land. "Go change out of your good clothes before you ruin them," Margaret told the children as they reached the front porch. "Then you can play until supper." They ran inside, a thunder of footsteps on the wooden floors, voices calling to each other as they scattered to their rooms. Margaret sank down onto the porch swing, suddenly tired in a way that had nothing to do with the walk. Silas sat down beside her. The swing creaked under their combined weight, the chains groaning. But it held them both just fine. They looked out at the land together, at the mountains rising blue and purple in the distance, at the horses moving lazy in the corral, at the road that wound away toward town and beyond, toward all the places Margaret had been and all the places she would never need to go again. "Been thinking about adding on to the house," Silas said after a while. "Another room or two, maybe more." "More room for what?" "Whatever comes along." He turned to look at her, and his eyes were steady and calm, holding something that might have been hope, might have been certainty. "More children who need a place, maybe. Lord knows there's plenty of them out there. And orphan trains ain't getting any kinder." Margaret understood then. This was what they would do, what they were meant to do, the two of them together. Take in the ones nobody else wanted. Build family from the broken pieces that other people threw away. "I'd like that," she said. "I'd like that just fine." Silas nodded, reached over and took her hand in his rough fingers wrapping around hers like they had always belonged there. They sat in the quiet of the afternoon, the swing rocking gentle beneath them, listening to the sounds of children's voices drifting out from inside the house. Dust rose on the distant road. A wagon train, heading west. the same kind of wagon train that had thrown her away all those months ago. Margaret watched it move across the horizon, watched the dust cloud grow smaller and smaller, until it was nothing but a pale smudge against the faraway mountains. She felt no anger, no longing, no pain. Just a quiet settling, like water finding its level, like a door finally closing on a room she no longer needed to enter. "Supper's almost ready," Rosa called from the kitchen doorway behind them. "You two planning to sit out there all day? Or you coming in to eat?" "Coming," Margaret called back. But she did not move. Not yet. She wanted to hold this moment just a little longer, to feel the weight of it, to remember exactly what it felt like to finally be home. Lily appeared in the doorway, her yellow dress already exchanged for everyday calico, her hair ribbon hanging loose and trailing down her back. "Aunt Maggie, my ribbon came undone again." Margaret rose from the swing, walked to the child, knelt down on the worn boards of the porch and retied the ribbon with fingers that knew the motion by heart now. That could do it in the dark. That would do it 1,000 more times before Lily was grown. "There you go, little one." Lily smiled that wide, unguarded smile that Margaret had come to love more than she had ever loved anything in all her years of living. "Come on," Margaret said, taking the child's small hand in hers. "Let's go have supper with our family." They walked inside together, into the warmth and the light and the smell of good food cooking, into the sound of boys arguing over nothing and Rosa humming as she stirred something on the stove. The door did not close behind them. It stayed open, letting in the evening breeze and the last golden light of the setting sun, welcoming whatever might come next. If you have stayed with me until now, I want you to know that I felt you here beside me through every word. There is something tender about a story like this one. It touches the quiet places we do not often show to others, the ache of being overlooked, the weight of carrying ourselves through days when no one seems to notice we are there. Many of us have stood on our own dusty roads, wondering if anyone would stop. Some of us are standing there still, waiting for a hand to reach out through the silence. Perhaps you recognize something familiar in Margaret's journey. Perhaps you have known what it feels like to be called a burden, to be left behind, to wonder if you would ever find a place where you belonged. These are not small things. They stay with us, folded quietly beneath the ordinary moments of our lives. You do not need to resolve what you felt while listening. Some feelings are not meant to be understood or explained away. They are simply meant to be acknowledged, to be allowed to rest, to exist without needing permission or apology. It is enough that you were here. It is enough that you listened. Thank you for your time. Thank you for staying until the end.